Welcome all of you to this press conference hosted by Right Livelihood. The press conference is held in English and is being recorded, just so you know. My name is Johannes Moskin, and I'm a public relations advisor at Right Livelihood. I'm based in Stockholm, and we are honored today to have Dana Moss joining us today from London. Dana is the International Advocacy Coordinator of Positions for Human Rights Israel. Welcome, Dana.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We're also honored to have Dr. Guy Shalev, PhD, Executive Director of Positions for Human Rights Israel, joining us. He's en route from meeting to meeting in Israel, and he won't have his video on, just so you know. So Physicians for Human Rights Israel received the Right Livelihood Award in 2010 for their indomitable spirit in working for the right to health for all people in Israel and Palestine. And I know that you have had extremely hectic days due to the really violent development in Israel and Palestine. And I want to give the floor down to you, Dana, for some opening remarks before we open up the floor for questions. And when we ask questions, please, either you can use the chat and write your questions in there, or raise your hand and one of my colleagues will give you the word. But please, Dana, the floor is yours.
Of course. Thank you, everyone. Just as a brief background, Physicians for Human Rights Israel, or PHRI, is an Israeli human rights organization focused on the right to health, as Johannes said, of all those under the responsibility of the government of Israel. So that includes Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory, also individuals in incarceration, asylum seekers and refugees, and citizens and residents of Israel, of the socio-geographic periphery. We do active humanitarian work on the ground. We have a mobile clinic that goes to Gaza once a month, staffed by volunteer physicians. And a mobile clinic goes once a week to villages in the West Bank. We have a clinic that is open to asylum seekers and other statusless people in our offices in Jaffa. And based on our humanitarian work, we carry out work to overturn unjust policies. I do want to say that several people, most of us in the office, are actively affected either by the war crimes that Hamas carried out on October 7th. Many of us know Palestinians in Gaza impacted by Israel's war crimes and aerial bombardment, including doctors and members of. His heart is breaking. Tracking the situation and trying to respond to the health needs, both in humanitarian work where we can, and in advocacy, both in Israel and in Gaza and the rest of the OPT. And I'll sort of elaborate on what we're doing in a moment. I will say that as a sort of political context, what we see is that we've long been working on the impact of the occupation, and as we see it, the apartheid regime that Israel has in the OPT on the de-development of the health system in the OPT, particularly in Gaza. And we have been tracking this for decades, since PHRI's establishment, and particularly ever since the imposition of the blockade in Gaza 16 years ago. And we have never seen anything similar to what is going on now, including in 2014. I'm not going to delve into the numbers of Palestinian dead and Israeli dead, the number of hostages, or the numbers of fatalities in the West Bank. We're talking about huge numbers. I'm happy to get, in the Q&A, I'm happy to get into the specific numbers. I do want to sort of give more perspective of what the health system in Gaza is going on at the moment, is going through at the moment, and put that within the context of the de-development of the healthcare system. Which the de-development has resulted from, Israeli policies of, fiscal, freeze on the fiscal on tax monies, Prevention of freedom of movement, denial, violation of freedom of movement of patients, healthcare workers, and this is something that's been happening for years. And of course, military assaults such as 2014, which damaged hospital infrastructure, the overload resulting from the Great March of Return, and now, of course, we have this, and the World Health Organization has documented over 59 attacks on healthcare facilities, including, which resulted also in 16 fatalities among healthcare workers and 28 injuries of healthcare workers on duty. These attacks have impacted 26 healthcare facilities, 23 ambulances. There are 4 hospitals which had to be evacuated because of Israeli orders and are no longer operational. And for us, these calls to evacuate hospitals are incredibly problematic and part of Israel's sort of forcible displacement. There is no way that these hospitals have, these individuals, patients have nowhere else to go. We've got overload extreme overload of hospitals in northern and in southern Gaza. Some patients cannot travel. The roads are being bombed. So we're incredibly concerned about that. For us, this is a call to violate medical ethics. What are the doctors supposed to do with their patients? Hospital staff, as I mentioned, are impacted, either through direct wounding, and also incredibly exhausted. We've got the huge number of wounded in Gaza. Today we're talking about over 12,000 individuals wounded. As from what we hear from the Palestinian Ministry of Health, and it's been corroborated in our conversations with doctors on the ground, staff is exhausted. In Shifa Hospital, which is the biggest hospital in Gaza, all 12 operating theaters are working 24/7. So surgeries have to take place in other wards. On top of that, you have a lack of equipment. In general, when we organize a PHRI mobile clinic to Gaza, which we do once a month, we often take disposable equipment with us because there's such a lack of essential equipment and medications. And this is something that happens, under the regular shadow of the blockade and long-standing occupation. And now what we're talking about is extreme, something we haven't seen before. So we heard from the director of the Palestinian Ministry of Health in Gaza that some surgeries are taking place without appropriate anesthesia. Other doctors have noted that they're sterilizing their equipment with vinegar. And then, once the operations are carried out, the patients are afraid to leave the hospital. So we're talking about patients and their families staying within the hospital grounds, and that sort of contributes to the extreme overload of the system. Israel has imposed an electricity blackout, and hospitals have to now rely on backup generators, which, as we understand, it depends on the hospital, but are running out, which impacts not only the general running of the hospital and the ability to respond to the huge number of wounded, but you also have over 1,000 dialysis patients in Gaza, approximately 100 preemies that rely on a regular supply of energy. And so we're incredibly worried about what that will mean. So that's, in short, what we see. And of course, you have Palestinian patients from Gaza who on the regular were receiving medical care within Israel. And what I mean by that is that Israel's policies resulted in the de-development of the Palestinian healthcare system in Gaza. So patients have to exit to secure the care they need elsewhere. And that can sometimes happen in Israeli hospitals, which of course the Palestinian Authority pays an inflated price for. It's not something that Israel gives out of its generosity of spirit. And we've understood that the patients that do receive permits, because in general there are very, very few permits given, with talking about fluctuating percentages, but the World Health Organization in the last few months spoke about only 60% of patients seeking medical care being able to receive a permit from the Israeli authorities. So the patients that are actually there have been transferred reportedly to the West Bank, which impacts their treatment. We're talking also about cancer patients, other complex cases, and in some cases we've understood that this essentially means an effective discontinuation of their treatments. And then there are other factors that impact the social determinants of health. So for Israel's forcible displacement means that there's an overload in southern Gaza. The lack of electricity means that the sewage isn't working properly, that the water isn't the water purification isn't working, and private vendors are the ones who are main suppliers of clean drinking water, which is very difficult for the impoverished population of Gaza, many of whom can't afford to buy clean drinking water. So people have resorted to consuming brackish water extracted from agricultural wells. So there we have exposure to pesticides, to other chemicals, which place the population at risk of an infectious disease outbreak or death. Most of the sewage pumping stations are not operational, which increases the risk of sewage flooding. And in some areas, sewage and solid waste is accumulating in the streets, which poses health and humanitarian hazard, and environmental hazard. I'll say that in terms of the work we're doing, is we're trying to track all this, and we're also tracking other human rights violations across Israel and the OPT that are sort of taking place without sufficient local or international media attention, because understandably all eyes are focused on Gaza. And what we're seeing is, for example, Palestinians detained by the Israeli authorities who are being denied access to Israeli hospitals, contrary to local international law, contrary to medical ethics. So people are being essentially turned away. Hospitals are there was a specific instruction from the Ministry of Health that hospitals in Israel not treat Palestinians detained by the Israeli authorities. These are not necessarily people who are related to the atrocities of October 7th. It's sort of this mass hysteria about this, which can be understood, but hospitals themselves have the obligation to maintain standards of medical ethics. And here you have directors of hospitals explicitly saying they will not admit Palestinians detained by the Israeli authorities, and instead, ambulances are being rerouted to the medical center of the Israeli prison service, which is unable to deal with critical cases, with complex cases, and this it looks like we're talking about severe violations of the right to health. We're hearing reports of increased violence by prison guards. Electricity has been shut off in prisons that house Palestinians. And these things are sort of happening without scrutiny because, as I mentioned, all eyes are focused on Gaza. And I'll speak a little bit about the work that we're doing here, because we're trying to not only keep an eye and sort of amplify what we see in terms of human rights violations, but also to provide care where we can. So we've had clinics for Israeli citizens from the south who've been evacuated following Hamas's war crimes. And we've had eight medical days treating roughly 400 individuals with our volunteer healthcare workers, both Israeli Jews and Palestinians. We have provided assistance to workers from Thailand who are employed in the Israeli South and who are not can access emergency medical care, but they don't necessarily have access to the public health system. We have also critically sent along to the Palestinian Ministry of Health a list of the necessary medication for the Israeli civilians, children and elderly abducted by Hamas. We received information from their doctors. So some of them volunteered in our mobile clinic. Others were, we received information about their medical needs through their doctors who heard of us through friends and other colleagues. For example, the head of the Crohn Society in Israel turned to us to request our assistance. others through, who are working as lobbyists for pharmaceutical companies. So we sent a list of the necessary medications that these individuals are taking every day to the Palestinian Ministry of Health in Gaza. And among our calls is very clearly to ensure that the hostages are released, and that until then that they receive the care and the dignity that they require. Aside from that, because of what I mentioned about the lack of medications available, we're asking for a humanitarian corridor. We're asking for access to medical equipment, medical supplies, the turning, end of the electricity, water, and fuel blackout, the ending of any evacuation orders to hospitals, protection for medical teams and health facilities, and ensure that through the humanitarian corridor, that there is medical evacuations for the injured to Egypt, the West Bank, or Israel, because of the overload of the Palestinian healthcare system in Gaza. I think, that's a sort of very general, that's a sort of brief overview. But of course, happy to delve in more detail. Yes, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for sharing this, Dana. A lot of information to process and very valuable insights on what's going on. Before leaving the floor to our journalists, I wanted to just ask you one question. A couple of days ago, Physicians for Human Rights Israel went out and said that the desire to take revenge on everyone, to starve them and deprive them on drinking water, etc., reflects a criminal policy that defies international humanitarian law, and you even call this a war crime. Could you say something about this and your position on what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We see war, as far as we've said, and we've said it very clearly, what Hamas did is a war crime. What Israel is currently doing is a war crime. You've got statements of intent of forcible displacement. We're not a legal organization per se. Okay, I'll say that very clearly. And our focus is more on the right to health and on medical ethics. But of course, we're talking about war crimes on both sides, for sure. We have heard, we've seen the UN Special Rapporteur speaking about concerns regarding ethnic cleansing. As mentioned, we're not a legal organization, but definitely what we see, attacks on medical facilities, disproportionate attacks on civilians. All these things are considered war crimes.
Thank you. So I see we have a question. Please, if you could share your name and your affiliation, we would appreciate that. So Paula, I'll give the floor to you.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for that. That is sharing your assessment of the situation there and all of the issues. My name is Paula Ducalibias. I'm with Geneva Solutions. I'd like to ask you about now the access for relief into Rafah. I know that there's no certainty exactly at this point when that may happen. But just wanted to understand a little bit the issues there, the amount of relief that would be needed compared to what is the trucks and I guess potentially personnel, I'm not sure, that's waiting on the southern border there. And also, security issues, whatever issues that may come up that relief organizations will have to deal with, and how that may or may not impact what you just described. And then also how you see sort of, again, it's sort of I would think difficult to assess, but longer term plans for relief groups responding to the needs in Gaza, given the fact that you've had this huge displacement and all of this destruction.
Those are all excellent points. I'll try and answer as best I can. As far as we understand, Rafah remains closed, which prevents the entry of very much needed humanitarian aid, food, water, medicines, and I think that's OCHA has estimated that there are roughly 3,000 tons of goods awaiting entry in trucks on the Egyptian side of the crossing. This is just a drop in the water to what's actually needed. But ultimately, whatever humanitarian, a humanitarian ceasefire needs to take place. Until, without that, there's not that much that can be done. And even after that is done, all, the blackout imposed and the forcible displacement prevents any sort of ability to appropriately respond to the needs of the individuals. We're talking about people crammed in shelters on the southern side. We're talking about lack of, the basic social determinants of health, including, clean water, etc. And so I think, this is sort of a reflection of what was happening even, before this current escalation. Before this current escalation, all sort of humanitarian assistance was a drop in the water, very necessary drop, right? But ultimately, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza has always been man-made, and it's always been political, and it always required a political solution. And now is the case, and now that applies even more, I'd say. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm still unmuted.
We hear you.
Okay. Yeah, just I mean, do you see do you see the situation? I mean, do you see any tides of political will on behalf of donors, perhaps shifting to to up that the assistance in light of this horrible conflict that's taking place?
I definitely see willingness to up humanitarian. We definitely see the concerns. But as I mentioned, they come from a very humanitarian perspective. And the challenge is that this humanitarian crisis has a political context. Until there's a humanitarian ceasefire, until there's no more orders for hospitals to evacuate, for the civilian population to evacuate, that willingness is insufficient.
So if I may, we also have questions in the chat. So this question is from Virginie. She's representing Tribune de Genève. And she says, thank you for being with us. How difficult is your work as an NGO while the major feeling of the Israeli population is revenge against Hamas? Are you considered by some people as a traitor, and are you facing threats?
It's a really good question. I think the civil space in Israel has been shrinking for many, many years. What we've seen now is just an amplification of that. So we've had individual work as a PHRI receiving threats. We've had we posted something, I can't remember what it was. I think it was regarding hospital evacuations. Can't quite remember. And received a message saying that we'll be next after Gaza. And obviously, we're looking for additional support for the security of individuals working within PHRI. And that's definitely a concern, whether it's verbal abuse or threats on social media. And it's a tough path to tread because we're a human rights organization and we have things to say that neither Palestinians nor Israelis like to hear, and at the same time, as I mentioned at the beginning, many of us are personally affected, whether it's hearing about colleagues in Gaza that have been evacuated, that have been forced to evacuate or been injured, or hearing or even died, or whether it's family and friends of ours in the south of Israel, or people who were at the NATO party who were injured or killed. It's not a simple time for us. So we're trying to do the little we can to maintain our specific perspective on medical ethics and on the right to health, and to try and stay true to ourselves during this time. And I also see a question about where I'm based. I'm very, very privileged. I was in London on a family holiday, and was planning to fly back on my birthday, which is October 7th, and then our flight got cancelled. I have 2 small children, and so I want to go back to my home. We're now currently hosting a family that doesn't have a bomb shelter in our apartment, but I want to go back. I just don't want to have children who experience what being in a bomb shelter is like and hear sirens, and I'm very aware that this is an incredibly privileged situation to be in. You have Israeli residents who cannot leave, who don't want to leave because they're burying the dead and the wounded. You have Palestinians in Gaza who are unable to leave because they're under a 16-year blockade, so they couldn't even leave beforehand, and definitely have nowhere else to go now, and don't even have the bomb shelters that I as an Israeli have access to. They don't have it's a nightmare what's happening over there. But at the same time, I have to take care of my family, and this is the decision I made to stay here for a little bit longer. Our executive director, who should be on this call, he's, as Johannes mentioned, he's en route. He is currently based in Israel, as is most of our staff that were not overseas at the time of the current escalation.
Thank you, Dana, for sharing that. We understand it's a very difficult situation for everyone in the region currently. Virginie also have a follow-up questions regarding, the criticism and threats that you received, and that's if it's difficult to find donators in these circumstances.
No, I actually think that a lot of at the same time, as we've been having people who are very unhappy with our response, we also have some of our supporters who are writing to us. We've had, when we mentioned that we were going to have a medical clinic to those evacuated from the south, we had an amazing response. We're now organizing a mobile clinic to the West Bank, because under the spotlight on Gaza, there's been an enormous uptick in settler violence. Over 60 Palestinians in the West Bank have been killed in the last since October 7th. We've had reports of treatments, including this has been something that's been in the Israeli newspapers, of soldiers who essentially carried out torture towards Palestinians, settlers who urinated on Palestinians. When we meant, as far as I understand, we're planning a mobile clinic, and there's a lot of response from our volunteer physicians who want to help out. People want to help out. People want to feel useful. So it's very easy, to find people from our community who want to be active and involved. And as far as I understand, there's also potential support from the from foundations here and there.
So I see a hand raised by Paula. Is it a new question that you would like to ask?
Yes, sorry, sorry, I didn't bring my hand down, but I do have other questions, and so I'm just wondering. I guess there's been calls already from various international organizations, the UN, the Red Cross, the ICRC, that made a statement last week about the violations of international humanitarian law. Just wondering what role you see the ICRC in particular playing. I know that there has been discussion by the Israeli as well as US authorities yesterday about them potentially getting engaged, assisting with the communication with the hostages in Gaza that are being held in Gaza, but well, that included, I mean, what role do you see the ICRC playing in this? Do you see it playing that traditional role, or potentially another wider role in Gaza right now?
It's really hard to answer that question. It's a good one. I don't know. I don't know what role they can play or they will play. I know that there have been no visits by the ICRC to Israeli prison settings since October 7th, and we've understood that there are over 4,000 Palestinians from Gaza, also workers, people who were here at the time of October 7th, who are currently detained by the Israeli authorities. We don't know where. We have very, very little information about their conditions and their legal status. And I think the ICRC should play a role there as well. But I can't say anything more. I did want to say one last thing about support from our community. I think that the role we play as an Israeli human rights organization that works to protect the right to health of Palestinians and Israelis means that there are. I don't want to sound too depressing. I think there are. What's happening now is terrible, but the point of flight really for us is our community. Aside from the willingness to sort of be part of our mobile clinics, we also had a joint letter by Palestinian and Israeli healthcare workers calling for a humanitarian corridor and calling for the release of captives, with over 100 signatures by Palestinian and Israeli healthcare workers. We had over 35 healthcare workers calling on Israeli hospitals to treat all individuals, regardless whether they're Palestinians detained after October 7th or not. It's sort of important to focus on those points of light as a means of maintaining our sanity during this time.
We've got a follow-up question regarding Gaza and
yes, I'm sorry, I can't see. Okay.
Yeah. Do you have any volunteers on the ground in Gaza right now, or how do you work with your?
So right. So for the past since our founding, we've had mobile clinics. So we've been established over 30 years ago. We have mobile clinics of volunteer healthcare workers. Our actually first medical mission, the first mission was to Gaza back in 1981 during the first Intifada, where the healthcare workers who volunteered sort of came, saw, treated patients, saw damage done to Shifa Hospital by the Israeli military during the first Intifada, and brought the information back to Israel to sort of have a public discussion on medical ethics, what that means for the occupation, how does the occupation impact the right to health, and that's sort of been our model ever since. So when we go to Gaza, which is roughly once a month, we have healthcare workers who are Israeli citizens. So they're Palestinian citizens of Israel. Israeli Jews are not allowed to enter into Gaza, and they're only healthcare workers. So they're based in Israel on a daily basis. They're working in the bigger, Israeli hospitals, whether it's Shalei Tzedek or Hadassah. We don't have any volunteers there on the ground now. We're hoping to be able to organize mobile clinic, but we don't know when that will be. We're organizing hardly a mobile clinic to the West Bank because we see the needs there are very great, and also as a means of solidarity, which is also one of the goals of our mobile clinics. Hope that answers your question.
I think that was a good answer and clear to everyone. Dana, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned some horrific numbers recently, or many horrific numbers. One of them was now that the spotlight is on Gaza currently, you mentioned that throughout the West Bank, there's been 60 Palestinians killed.
And yeah, according to OCHA, as of yesterday, there were 64 fatalities.
And those are Palestinians killed by Israeli settlers.
Yes, that's the breakdown isn't Israeli settlers versus soldiers, which often closely cooperate, and sometimes the soldiers, their position is to guard the Palestinians from the settlers. So it's unclear, but I'm happy to connect whoever's interested in further details with Yesh Din organization, an Israeli human rights organization that actively tracks these numbers.
So I wanted to bring back the conversation to like an overall context, because I know that Physicians for Human Rights has been clear over the past 10 days that human rights cannot be detached from historical and political reality. And you wrote that it's your obligation, your human obligation, to contextualize the violence, and that this type of understanding is crucial. Could you say something about the context that you see leading up to the war we see now, with so many people displaced and people killed?
Right, I think. So the political context is the humanitarian crisis in Gaza has its roots in the 16-year blockade, which has very detrimental consequences for health infrastructure. The reason what we call what's happening now in the OPT as apartheid in health is because Israel, as an occupying power, has responsibility for the Palestinian healthcare system and the development of the Palestinian healthcare system and the resulting gaps in health indices, even before the current escalation between Palestinians and Israelis, has been very, very clear. For example, if you look at infant mortality, it's always been much, much higher in the OPT than in Israel, several times higher. And that's why we term the situation as apartheid in health. And there's no way that a developed healthcare system could respond to the aerial assault on Gaza. And so that's the sort of context that we mean when we're looking at it. I think no good can come out of Israel's long-standing occupation and apartheid regime, and that is obviously no justification for Hamas's war crimes. We don't know what the future will hold, but for us, human rights and adherence to human rights must be at the forefront of whatever happens.
So we've got several questions in the chat, and maybe we can start with a question from Ida Espeshan, which is, does the Hamas attack challenge your principles?
No, our response to the Hamas attack was very, very clear. It's a war crime, and the abduction of civilians is a war crime. There have been reports of unknown numbers of women who were raped and sexually assaulted, and again, this is a war crime. We're a human rights organization. It's on us to call things as we see it. It shocked us, and it horrified us, and many of us are personally impacted by it, but it didn't change our principles. And I see the next question. Yeah. Does our organization coordinate with the WHO and other humanitarian organizations? Yes, we work very closely with the WHO, a part of the WHO's health cluster, health advocacy cluster, and our work. We coordinate with Médecins du Monde and others on the ground. Our work with local and international medical humanitarian organizations is very, very important to us, and that hasn't changed. And I see the next question is, do you fear that the conflict could lead to riots in Israel as in Lod in 2021? And how, as NGOs, would you like to prevent it? I think that we've seen that there's been an incredible amount of incitement from the Israeli governments, and there's been a very sort of they've even asked the Israeli universities to sort of report back to them in case any students actively support Hamas. And as you know, lifting a Palestinian flag in Israel is illegal, and there's been a police crackdown on that ever since an increased police crackdown on that ever since the new extreme right government took place. So this incitement is incredibly concerning to us. We see it on the ground, and we see it in medical facilities. So, for example, a few days ago, I can't remember the date, there was members of La Familia, sort of an extreme right organization that sort of stormed into a hospital in Israel looking for Palestinian who were detained by the Israeli authorities, causing great anxiety for all the hospital staff and patients. There really was a rampage. So we're incredibly worried about that. And I think that the more that human rights violations that happen without media, without international spotlight, the more that those take place, the more that this sort of thing is likely to happen, as it sort of increases friction. And we, for us, our work sort of, like as I mentioned, is not actively trying to combat this, but our belief is that healthcare workers are unique, and for that, whether they're Palestinians or Israelis, they can work together to safeguard medical ethics, and that's what we've been trying to do, whether it's in our joint calls to ensure a humanitarian corridor and release the captives, whether it's in our calls to Israeli hospitals to treat all those equally. And there are many civil society organizations who are trying actively to protect against this. So, for example, there's a group called, hold on, let me check the correct name, the Guard for Jewish Arab Partnership, and they are active in many cities right now. I'm part of the one on the WhatsApp group of the one in Jaffa, Tel Aviv, and they are having, they have a hotline. They have joint activities for children, for in Hebrew and Arabic. So there are organizations actively working to protect against this. They are actively collecting whatever is needed for those evacuated from Gaza, from those from the Bedouin areas in the south who are currently petitioning, who don't have shelters from the unrecognized villages. And this is something that we're also working on at PHRI. But the organizations actively collecting and keeping this idea of preventing a return of 2021 as much as possible, which is difficult because this is, the feeling is that the various members of the government and various sectors of the extreme right would like to see this happen.
Thank you so much for sharing, Dana. Maybe one of the last questions, at least from my side, would be if you could talk about the response that you want to see from the international community at this point. The world is watching what's going on, and with this we have journalists from Sweden, Denmark, Switzerland, and also other countries. So could you say something about the message from physicians for human rights?
We have several points that as we see, the international community has to step in to ensure the full protection of the civilian population in Israel and Gaza, and to urge for an immediate ceasefire we asked the international community to ensure the release of Israeli hostages held by Hamas, to ensure immediate and swift access to essential humanitarian supplies in Gaza, including electricity, water, fuel, medical supplies. We urge the international community to demand that Israel refrain from issuing evacuation orders to hospital, and that Israel ensures protection for medical teams and health facilities, and that the international community immediately facilitate medical evacuations for the injured and patients to Gaza, the West Bank, or Israel. Those are this is the sort of our major demands.
Thank you, Dana, for that. I don't see any further questions. We'll give it a couple of seconds more before we wrap this up. I just want to remind everyone that we are recording this press conference, and if you would like to access the recording, please send an email to any Right Livelihood staff. We're happy to share it with you.
I see one more question. Okay, thank you, Paula, and thank you to all of you for taking the time to listen. And yeah, I'm happy to write my email address here to everyone. So please feel free to circulate it. I'm not sure if I can circulate it to just the hosts and they can pass it on. Or,
we will make sure to share your contact.
Okay, wonderful.
Dana,
Thank you.
and maybe if you also could share with us a link to some photos and other things that you possess at Positions for Human Rights Israel.
Right. Unfortunately, I'm connecting from my phone, so I can't do that right now. But happy to do so as follow-up. Happy to share with you our most recent statements, and of course, I urge you all to follow our Twitter.
So do we. Thank you so much, Dana and Guy, for joining us. Your work is really a beacon of hope in this dark time. We're honored to spend this almost 1 hour together with you, and I know you're super busy, so we won't keep you longer. Thank you again.
Thank you to all of you for listening. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.